I call this paper the Extinction Paradox. I'll post a longer written version to my website, www.bunzl.org. And that longer version is considerably more subtle than this one, which is limited by considerations of time. Paul Hawken admonishes us to, quote, leave the world better than you found it, take no more than you need, try not to harm life or the environment, make amends if you do, close quotes. Let's assume we do the opposite of that. Then, whom do we wrong? Well, it takes a philosopher to find fault with the obvious answer that we wrong future generations. Before the philosophers complicate things, that we owe something to future generations seems obvious if we concede that we owe something to those alive now when it comes to sharing resources. Indeed, it seems to follow directly from it unless you think that time makes a difference. Your spaceship breaks down and you're forced into an emergency pod, a lifeboat in space, with 9 others and a limited amount of food and water. How should you dole out the supplies? For most people, the obvious answer is that we should do so on an equal basis, all other things being equal. Now imagine that the spaceship was able to travel in time and space and took on passengers, so some come from the future. At least by my lights, this leaves my intuitions about sharing the resources on an equal basis unchanged. Of course, the spaceship is a metaphor for Earth, and the passengers are its inhabitants, both now and in the future, who must share its limited resources. Time travel helps here because it lets us put those in the future and those in the here and now on an equal moral footing. Without it, we may be queasy about embracing the idea that those who don't exist now have a claim on us now. But do they? The intuition that they do not is that only people can have such claims on us, not potential people. And people located in the future are only potential or people or possible people in the here and now. So we either need to allow that possible people do in fact have claims on us, or allow that people in the future can have claims that reach back to times at which they don't exist. But the first alternative is an obvious non-starter, if only because of the infinite number of people, rather the infinite number of possible people. If we treat them all as having a claim as actual people and share equally with them, everyone's share will approach zero. Now, you might object that merely possible people don't need a share of anything. It's only those who are potential people now and will become actual people later who do, when that need is viewed from an atemporal point of view. But that's just to embrace the second position. What makes the second position seem problematic is that it assumes certainty about the future now. And that is what we are doing in the time travel thought experiment. At most, what the thought experiment shows is that if we assume certainty, then treating those future beings as having claims on us now seems straightforward. At least it does if we think it's straightforward that we have claims on each other in the first place. The problem arises when we confuse that with a more realistic state of affairs in which we don't know which possible people will become actual people in the future. Still, why does that matter? Why does it matter if we don't know who they are as long as we know their number? And while we may not know the exact number, we can make a rough estimate, and that is enough to listen to Hawken. We should strive to leave things better, or if not at least no worse, than the way we found them for those who will follow us. A corollary of that would seem to be this: if we don't listen to Hawken, we wrong those who will follow us. Not so fast. Suppose we act as Hawken's evil twin and set out to destroy the planet. Destroy it so much that no humans can follow us. Then there will be no actual people in the future for us to have wronged. Now, how could this be right? For it seems to sanction the following absurdity. If there are future generations and we damage the planet, we do them a wrong. But if we damage it enough so there are no future generations, then we do not. So all other things being equal, it would be better to damage the planet a lot rather than a little. But is this an absurdity? Assume that no woman has an obligation to conceive children. Now consider the following thought experiment. Suppose all the women of a whole generation happen to all share the individual preference against reproduction. Of course, deciding not to have children when everyone else is also deciding not to have children as well is very different from the choice of deciding not to have them, assuming others will. Both existential and practical consideration make it an implausible choice. But suppose it was the choice that everyone made. They looked at the existential void of being the last generation and embraced it. And perhaps technology might have advanced enough in their generation that robots could nurse them over death's door. Existential and practical considerations notwithstanding, what matters for our purposes is whether or not the force in favor of respect for reproductive freedom, at least reproductive freedom not to have children, is weakened when it happens to be shared universally. Well, someone might ask, what about a shared obligation to continue the human race? Surely that is what matters here. But what's the basis for this obligation given our rejection of the possible people that have rights? But then what's the difference between this case and the case in which we don't all happen to decide not to produce future generations, but instead all act knowing that our actions may produce the same result? Of course, we don't actually all do so, but assume for the sake of argument that we do. We allow our short-term interests to trump other considerations for one reason or another. Suppose we do so with the confidence that if things go badly and our actions bring about extinction, we can manage the decline of our species to spare the last remnants of Homo sapiens anything but a fun-filled demise, a Bacchanalian last blast. Then once again we may ask, whom have we wronged? Well, the answer might hinge on this. The road to the ruin of our species is unlikely to be selective, to just cause the demise of our species alone, as it were. Well, what then of other species? Do we not wrong them by our actions? Let's assume that at least some animals other than humans have moral standing for the purposes of argument. But if only actual, not just potential human beings in the future have moral standing, why should the same not apply to other species? Assume it does. Then we're off the hook when it comes. Then are we off the hook when it comes to them as well? Well, here's why we're not. We grounded denying our own existence by destroying the planet as an extension of the moral defense of the choice of all of us not to have children. But in the case of animals, we're doing more than that. We're interfering with the choices of others. Now, the idea that it would be better to damage the planet a lot rather than a little when it comes to our own kind is what I call the extinction paradox. If the above argument holds, rather than answering it directly, we can only blunt its bite by appealing to animal rights. That in itself seems paradoxical. We don't normally think of our obligation to animals as stronger than our obligation to our own kind. Besides, I have another problem with this account. I don't think of most of nature as having moral standing because its denizens lack the capacity that we normally take to be a condition on moral standing. That is, the capacity for phenomenal consciousness. Look at pictures of large swathes of the Amazon that have been deforested. Look at the devastation. And can one deny that a wrong has been done? But whom or what has been wronged? Yes, the native people. Yes, all of humanity that is surrounded by less of nature's variety and beauty. But these are moral judgments that revolve around us, around our needs. But what about nature itself and all of the clearly non-conscious species our actions are driving to extinction? Can we make sense of whether or not this is wrong without reference to what is good for ourselves? Now, one way to do this might be to appeal to the notion of transcendentalism. Transcendentalism invites the idea that we efface the boundaries of the self not only with each other, but also with nature. Our moral considerations will then attach to a wider subjective concern. Bracketing the question of whether or not this is a variant of anthropocentrism, suppose we allow that we are in some sense one with nature. But to the extent that moral discourse is about conflict between moral agents and its resolution, we can't all be one with each other and with all of nature. Suppose you are one with the cockroaches, some grand Samsorian thought experiment. Presumably your behavior towards them will now be constrained, but constrained by what? Not their interests, since if they had interests, we would not be in the quandary we find ourselves in. It's the interests that arise from the fusion of you and them into one unitary subject. The intuition here is that even if the cockroaches don't care about their well-being, the fusion of you and them does. Now, I actually think this is a profound and subtle conception that recognizes the psychological reality of self-interest but attempts to transform it and therefore harness it. If we seek our own self-preservation, then we will seek the preservation of other species as well, so long as we allow ourselves to fuse with them. And yet, this still has the air of a world without risk of the kind of conflicts that give rise to moral discourse in the first place. A world in which it is us versus the cockroaches, as it were. Instead of all of this talk about transcendentalism and fusion, let me restate that. Indeed, all of this talk about transcendentalism and fusion will strike some as tortured in a way to avoid a much more natural prescription, to simply look with awe at what is the case. In one sense, this second is a much better prescription, since what it holds out is the prospect of truly inspiring us with a thick sense of awe. On the other hand, my prescription is bloodless and brittle, a thin construct of an intellectual argument. My argument can't compete with the emotions that a walk through the giant redwoods in Muir Woods evokes in us. And while I can try to marry the two, that seems like a prescription to undermine both the clarity of my thinking and the quality of my feeling about what is the case. Perhaps it would be better to just lead with the emotions. But the emotions are a dangerous guide if we care about fairness, for they are subject to the vagaries of our preferences, which themselves are subject to our prejudices. You may look with awe at the redwoods, that surely lack any interests of their own, but pity the poor viruses of the world, Ebola, HIV, polio, Zika. If the redwoods, then why not them as well? So, is the extinction paradox really a paradox? Would it be better to damage the planet a lot rather than a little? Well, notice I don't need to show that all of nature has moral standing to block the argument, just some non-human parts of it. And even though I doubt this is the case, some of you may think that is the way things are. But you will still be left with a puzzle that in itself seems paradoxical. We don't normally think of our obligation to animals as stronger than our obligations to our own kind. But wait, now if we relax an assumption I made earlier that we all decide we don't want children, then we can solve the paradox directly. Like the case of animals, destroying the planet wrongs those of us who want children by interfering with our choice to do so, even if it does not wrong the children they want to have. In this sense, Hawkins' admonition is not about our obligation to future generations, it's about our obligation to each other in the here and now. And if there's a place to engage the idea of transcendentalism and fusion in a morally productive way, perhaps it is here with respect to each other and not the rest of the nature that we should look. Thank you.